Hello everyone, this is Maz. If you're hearing this message, it means you're not part of the Voices of War subscriber community and will only hear the first half of the episode. If that's enough, then I'm thrilled. However, if you're looking to dive deeper into the complexities of war, please consider subscribing to our private feed by using the link at the top of the show notes. By doing so, you'll gain access to all of our episodes, the ability to ask follow-up questions, and we'll become part of an exclusive community that makes this show possible. I hope you'll make the decision to join us today.
Your sense making is not the only one, or your conclusion about things is not the only possible one. So to empathize actually means to be willing to consider a competing perspective on something. In an empathetic grasp of even ISIS becomes an important thing to pursue. That I think sounds weird to many ears, but if we just hang on to what I mean by empathetic grasp, it becomes strategically vital in order to understand not only where they're coming from and what's motivating them to do it, but therefore being equipped to better offset what they're doing. When you don't have a sociopath on your hands and you actually have a far more common normal soldier, they're going to reflect on the actions they've done at some point. I think we're actually obligated to equip them to reflect well.
My guest today is Kevin Cutright, who's a Lieutenant Colonel in the US Army and an Associate Professor in the Department of English and Philosophy at the US Military Academy at West Point. During his career, Kevin has served 2 tours in Iraq, one providing fire support in a field artillery unit and one advising Iraqi border police. He has also served 2 tours in South Korea, one coordinating fire support and then, much later, as strategy and plans chief for an army headquarters. Kevin's operational experiences have driven his interest in the ethics of military planning and conduct, the role of empathy, as well as moral injury. He holds a PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University, an MA in philosophy from Vanderbilt University, and a master's degree in military art and science from the US Army's School of Advanced Military Studies. Kevin joined me today to discuss his book, The Empathetic Soldier, which was published last year. I recently finished the book and found Kevin's views on empathy to be hugely relevant, as well as critically important, both for the military practitioner, but also for those who send us to war. Kevin, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
Sure glad to be here, Maz. Appreciate the opportunity.
So before we get to the role of empathy in war, as I said to you before, I really enjoyed the book. Thoroughly enjoyed it and found it, and I really mean it, very important and a critical topic for discussion. But before we get to it, let's find out a little bit more about your own background. So how did you end up in the Army in the first place? And then what motivated your entry into academia and ultimately a professorship?
Yeah. A lot of the American military folks might come from military families, but I'm not one of them. My father was a Marine before I was born. And then he always had maybe a heart for the military. But I had no conception of military service. I grew up in Fresno, California, where there's not a large military contingent there.
Mm-hmm.
But by high school, my father wanted to plant the seed with both my brother and I of opportunities that might be out there. Not just military. Believe it or not, he took us on a trip from California to the East Coast. And because he was a former Marine, right, we started at the U.S. Naval Academy. And
once a Marine, always a Marine, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, for sure. But then we went up the coast, and we stopped at Princeton University. We stopped at Yale and Harvard, but we also stopped at West Point. And we came away from the trip, both of us kind of enamored by what we had seen there at the U.S. Military Academy. So I left high school in California and 18 days later reported to the basic training that they offer here at the U.S. Military Academy.
Oh, wow.
And then 4 years later, in 1996, I became a field artillery officer and have been serving ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. So 18 days. Wow, that's a quick turnaround. You got to enjoy a few days off at least before they shaved your head.
Yeah. I definitely had family members who were a bit flabbergasted, right? Like, what is Kevin Cutright doing thinking about the military? And one relative, in fact, who asked me why I wanted to be a baby killer. And it was a kind of lingering concern maybe that she'd had from the whole Vietnam era of things. And I didn't want to be a baby killer. So in many regards, I think even some of that reception of serving in the military and then launching to this place bolstered maybe my own interest in morality and in how is it that you can be a soldier and still maybe be on the moral up and up, those kinds of things. So I said I branched field artillery, and honestly, you had some incredible experiences with both the leadership and with the missions. Lo and behold, the way our U.S. Army runs things is one of the broadening assignments you can apply for when you're a senior captain is to come teach the military academy. And so I got one of those opportunities, and that's what triggered the master's degree at Vanderbilt University, and then teaching for 3 years, and I was hooked. I loved the classroom. I loved working with cadets and talking through these difficult topics. I taught philosophy and ethical reasoning with a focus towards the end of the semester on military ethics in particular, the just war tradition. And so I left hoping for an opportunity to come back. And for the last 5 years, lo and behold, I've had my dream gig of being back. And I finally had to abandon the cross cannons symbol of field artillery when I became a permanent professor here. A military tenure that they offer. And I'm officially now what they call an academy professor in Army parlance.
So they won't basically post you out of there. So you won't be posted out of there in another lieutenant colonel position somewhere else. I think this is
not anymore. This is my permanent gig now. Until retirement. So it's just I look back and I'm very thankful because I didn't know that there was such a route you could walk where you have 1 foot in the operational experiences and yet 1 foot in some serious scholarship and academic duties, and that's just been a great combination for me.
I think that's a great advantage of the US system. We don't have anything like that in Australia, which is, in my view, a deficiency, because we have people who are, highly educated in the military ethics space, who've got useful experiences, who've taught this at quite prestigious universities, military academies, etc. But we don't really have too many, certainly no uniformed personnel, unless I'm mistaken, unless there's something I don't know, but we don't have any uniformed personnel. Certainly when I went through the Australian Defence Force Academy or the Royal Military College, there are no uniformed PhD doctors who are teaching and facilitating these types of discussions, which I think is a deficiency, because not only do you bring the academic aspect into it, but of course you bring in the operational, real lived experience of how this applies in combat or in a war zone.
Yeah, it's a really neat opportunity to try to embody the soldier scholar cliche that we hear about and talk about a lot. And so that's just been a neat role to try and play. You're right. In a way, it could be considered a deficiency. It's certainly a fairly costly way to go, right? Who else really wishes they could do this is the U.S. State Department. They wish too that they had a bench of personnel such that they could afford to have several at graduate school as a full-time student for years, and then serving in a kind of a teaching assignment like this. So I do think it's important for us in the U.S. military and specifically U.S. Army to recognize maybe luxury that it is.
Of course. Because if I just think about it, I mean, to take out lieutenant colonels, majors, whatever, to go and start doing I'm currently doing my PhD. I'm a major on a fellowship. I'm very fortunate to be on a scholarship basically for this year. But that's, again, few and far between, and it's certainly there's no pathway necessarily towards some teaching somewhere in one of our military establishments. It is basically my great fortune that the establishment has given me this year to pursue further studies. Could have been any other studies, not a PhD, could have been a master's, which is generally what it's designed for, but it's just, my luck of the draw. But there's no, like you make the point, we don't have the luxury to be able to remove people. We don't have enough people as it is anyway to fill the operational roles. let alone pull them out to then go and into the teaching establishments, as much as that might be quite beneficial, really long term.
Right. And I've really been encouraged to see some of the senior leaders really endorse the idea too, right? I mean, General Mully, for one, has always been a consistent fan of the setup as it is, and several others, right? I mean, it's well endorsed. Now, again, if you can get the resources to do it, it's a really incredible model, I think, to employ. And I say that having been on the receiving end of it as a cadet, and then not realizing how much I would grow on the teaching end of it. Both my first assignment for a 3-year assignment, and then this last one in the last 5 years. It's a great chance to continue growing in all sorts of ways too. Yeah,
undoubtedly. Okay, so let's get to the topic of at least of this book. I'm sure you're focused on studying and researching a lot of other things to do with just war tradition, and I think, I believe history, obviously, if you're part of history and philosophy department. But how did you stumble upon empathy, and why empathy? Why has that? Why did you find yourself drawn to it?
Yeah, it sounds awkward, but would this be the moment to say that my views are my own and not those of West Point or the U.S. Army or the U.S. government? But
absolutely, my apologies. That's yeah, of course.
No. I'd forgotten it earlier anyway. But yeah, how did I get interested in empathy? Shoot, I landed myself at the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where you have to write an extensive thesis on something to do with operational planning. And in preparation for that assignment, we're in courses where we're reading a whole bunch of our own doctrine. And lo and behold, I can't believe it, but there in our counterinsurgency doctrine, the big rewrite of 2006, the word empathy is in there. And the more I explored it, the more, for me, it came to capture so much of what I saw as shortcomings over my first deployment to Iraq, 0304, and my second deployment to Iraq from 2009, 2010. And I just saw it capturing it almost as a one-word after-action review comment. A lack of empathy maybe driving so much of what had gone wrong. And in some ways, I think there's actually some important accounts of where it helps explain what went right when it comes to the winning of hearts and minds or the rest of the tasks involved with counterinsurgency. So credit to that faculty at that school. They allowed me the latitude to run with this kind of crazy idea of, hey, I want to look at empathy and its relevance for operational planning. And so that's what started it. The more I dug into it, the more I started running across two different confusions that seemed at play. One was a big confusion over what empathy actually is. The literature's got a number of competing theories and conclusions about it, and it makes it so easy maybe to just dismiss empathy either as a real thing or at least as a real precise thing. And then the second confusion, I think, has to do with the military profession, what it means to be a soldier, what the nature of soldiering is really meant to be all about. Depending on what your conclusion is there, it can either leave room for empathy having a role to play, or in fact, no role to play. So SAMS, that School of Advanced Military Studies, was the first opportunity maybe to really explore those confusions on my own. I titled the monograph thesis "Empathy for Carnivores," hoping that would at least get the faculty and my peers to like open the page, right, and see maybe what it involved.
Great catchy title, because that's what I was going to say. I mean, empathy in many ways comes across as it's too soft. It's a little bit too touchy-feely. It's too emotive. But as you know, as you and I talked about, I mean, I teach empathy to some of our students in the Australian Army, and I consider it to be a principal tool for developing relationships of trust with anyone, especially those in a foreign context, in an operational setting, where you're trying to establish some sort of common goals and a common purpose. And I really want to pick up on the points you made about Iraq, because that to me, it strikes me as relevant. Why you saw where we failed through empathy and maybe even some successes. But before we get to that, maybe it's useful to just define empathy so that everybody's on the same sheet of music. As you have done in the book, because I think it really sets the context as to what empathy is, but more importantly, what it's not.
after canvassing a bit of the literature, I mean, in the end, the definition I come down to, as I express in the book, is it's an experiential understanding of what another feels or thinks, not just a theoretical understanding that the other feels or thinks a certain way, right? So it's not just the ability to attribute to another, oh, they're happy, but maybe having some grasp, some understanding of what that means to experience happiness or to feel that way. Comes in degrees. Obviously, we're going to be able to empathize more or less, partly due to our own experiences to draw from, and partly due to our own imaginative ability that we can apply well or poorly. But yeah, the fundamental definition of empathy, I want to say, is that experiential understanding of the other, understanding their experience. Not agreeing with the experience, right? Here's one of the immediate confusions that can come up so quickly is to understand another. I have students sometimes who think that what I'm trying to ask them to do is agree with the other. And so we have to spend some time separating those. Concepts.
That's a hugely important, and you're right. That's the first thing that people go for. I mean, the one I use, the definition I use for my lessons, I use Brené Brown. I mean, purely because she's an academic, obviously, but she's also very, very good at popularizing some rather difficult topics, I think, in easy to understand concepts. But the way she defines it is connecting to the emotion underpinning an experience rather than the experience itself, which I think is very much in line with what you're saying, right? And I use that as a vehicle for my discussions because coming from a rich Western nation where, when we go deploy somewhere, generally speaking, the places we deploy are vastly different to, the country we come from. So it's very difficult for people to contextualize and connect and visualize an experience, right? I mean, most of the people that I've taught don't know what it's like to have lived through 3 wars, to have lost half your family, to have changed who you swear allegiance to 4 times, etc., which is something we've seen, in the more recent wars. But everybody understands the emotion underpinning those, right? So everybody knows what fear feels like, what joy, as you mentioned, joy and happiness, what they feel like. So it's about recognizing and connecting, in my view, to that emotion that might be underpinning a given experience, which is why I really find Brené's quote quite neat, because it at least for me, it gives me a useful vehicle to then open up a discussion as to how our experiences might differ, but we're all human. Ultimately, we all feel the same emotions, and that seems to, at least in my limited experience of teaching this stuff, seems to resonate with a lot of people. And I'm sure that happens to you as well when you start talking about the actual connecting to that emotional piece that you're referring to.
Yeah. Can I nerd out for a minute?
Please, 100%.
Because in the research I was doing, one, I think Brené Brown's definition is completely helpful, right? I mean, I think it is capturing maybe the heart of what we mean by empathy. And sociologists have this distinction between an etic, ETIC understanding of others versus an emic, EMIC understanding. Have you actually run across these terms?
In your book, I have, and I've highlighted them as a question, but as a sub question to perhaps dive into, and I welcome it. Let's go. 100%. I found it to be a very useful definition to contextualize what we're talking about.
And I think it helps capture maybe at least one element of what I mean by empathy being an after-action review word for Iraq. Yeah. And I can't help but think Afghanistan, even though I actually haven't deployed to Afghanistan. So an etic understanding is this grasp of everything that's observable. So say pretend you're a sociologist looking at a group. I don't know, maybe they're conducting some kind of a habitual practice or tradition, and the etic understanding would mean this grasp of when they're conducting this ceremony, with what artifacts, who in the group is leading it, maybe what time of day they're doing it or location they're doing it. I mean, all these things that are observable facts of a tradition or an act or a ceremony. The emic understanding, the EMIC, would be the meaning behind those actions for that group. And maybe the way in which the action or the ceremony connects with their overall worldview or sense that they make of the world. So, I mean, all these kind of immaterial inside knowledge, if you will. One thing it clicked with me when I ran across this was like, I couldn't help but think of the pre-deployment preparation that both of my units received before we headed out to Iraq. We get the We get the Iraqi phrases, so we might be able to bungle our way through how to say hello and how are you doing. We get the pretty rapid and rough cut tossing out of facts of, hey, you're going to see this thing called Ramadan. It's going to occur in these times, last kind of this long, and very little mention maybe of what it means at all or any of that. And so
the context, the nuance, yeah.
And of course, all this was under the label of cultural knowledge and improving our ability to build bridges and stuff. And there's a point where, kind of as I argue in the book, my goodness, I think someone equipped with all sorts of that cultural knowledge could still fail to build bridges really easily. I mean, I watched some of it, maybe of peers who, they still had a kind of disdain, right, for locals or for things that were just different, right? Whether or not they, had disdain specifically for Iraqis or just had a disdain for things that were just so outside of their own experience, right?
Yeah.
And so that lack of empathy right there, I think, prevents the bridges from getting built, regardless of how much knowledge you have on Islam or on Iraq's history and those kind of things. Now, maybe the more you study that stuff, it could be the more you actually might generate empathy or an empathetic grasp of another, but it's not guaranteed. And I think it's really contingent upon maybe the character of the person or a kind of openness or commitment, right, to doing so. It's not necessarily automatic.
And also naming it, which is what I think your book does. It names it, right? It gives it a name, right? We could use EMIC as an example. EMIC sounds academic, sounds esoteric, sounds out there. And I probably confidently can say that most people in uniform would go, dude, I'm not going to get, time out. I'm not doing an EMIC understanding of Afghanistan. But whereas if you start talking about empathy, empathy is something we do so naturally, all of us, to our children, to our spouses, to our partners, to our family and friends. We get to experience, we recognize their world because it's similar to ours. So therefore, it's a lot easier to build that bridge and feel or see the world through their eyes. Whereas, as you made the point so eloquently, when you go to an Afghanistan, to an Iraq, where everything is different, I mean, like, it's not just the obvious overt traffic rules or not, buildings or not, terrain, dress, the obvious kind of, the ethic, as you said, the ethic, am I pronouncing that right? That's the kind of obvious, overt ones and zeros, so to speak. But even the subcontext, the jokes, humor, the way emotions are expressed is vastly different. And of course, for those who are not accustomed to that, to deal with that, it can be quite frightening and scary. And of course, can push them away. And it's very easy to then paint an us and them and drive a wedge between those who you're there trying to help. If you do not employ empathy as a credible tool to really try and see, to give context, to give color to the black and white that you're seeing in front of you.
Yeah. And even a well-intentioned Western soldier deployed out that direction can really fall short, right, without an exercise of genuine empathy. There is another element of my research. There was a great lecture I ran across. I think it was the Archbishop of Canterbury. I can't remember the gentleman's name right now, but he had served in that capacity. He was giving this lecture on the problems of empathy, and he points out that, hey, one problem is we might approach circumstances where we know we need to empathize with this attitude of, I know exactly how you feel, and then start rolling from there. When in fact, he points out, no, we need to start from the position of, I have no idea how you feel. And then only from there do you get it maybe into genuine empathy. And so the well-intentioned soldier or something like that might still make this error of projection, right? And projecting one's own attitudes or experiences or ways in which they would feel in whatever they're saying of those observable facts, right? The locals must feel the same way. They must. How could there possibly be another way of experiencing this? That would be another way in which things have gone wrong, because the projection ends up contributing to very detailed plans on things that in the end aren't going to be received in the way that's being assumed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're completely misinterpreting what you're seeing based on your own bias and your own lens that you're bringing into it, despite the fact that you might think, you might fool yourself into believing that this is exactly what they want. Because even if they tell you, I want a well here, well, that might not actually be what's really behind it. But that's merely what you're getting, because that's all you're giving the opportunity to for them to provide, right? Which is
right.
And we've seen that time and time again. It's what can we fix? Oh, well, we need a well here, we need a road there, but that might not actually exactly right. Or my cousin's house over there has been bombed, so let's fix that house, right? Of course, right. There is that too. There is that too, right? Which is and I don't even put this into the context of your Afghans or Iraqs. I mean, this is Bosnia. This is any situation where exactly it's humans, right? Where there are haves and have-nots, and somebody who has comes and offers you something. Hey, you'll take what you can, and I put myself into this. I would do exactly the same thing. But there's one point that you make in the book, and I really liked, and that is that empathy kind of goes beyond knowledge and understanding of culture, which is what we're talking about so far. These kind of cultural briefs, history, and customs. How well is this understood, do you think? I mean, how is this a confusion that you still wrestle with, even with the cadets that you teach? That empathy is kind of thrown in amongst this kind of culture, history, customs piece.
Yeah, I think there is still a confusion, on what empathy is asking for, or what it's gesturing at, because it does move beyond the mere facts of the other person or the other group's situation. It does, in the end, speak, I think, to a bit of an attitude. There's even a way in which, in order to properly empathize, you actually have to be willing to take on a bit of vulnerability. And I guess I do mean that in some kind of emotional sense, sure. Mm-hmm. Because you are, if you're truly empathizing, you might be exposing yourself to a kind of vicarious experience that could be really painful. Mm. And so there's that kind of vulnerability. But then another kind of vulnerability that empathy demands is a sense in which your sense-making is not the only one, or your conclusion about things is not the only possible one. Mm. So to empathize actually means to be willing to consider a competing perspective on something. Mm. And that's also something that can be really hard to do, right? Particularly under the stress of a deployment, when you're already maybe just trying to hold things together in your own mind for your own family or for your battle buddies. It's a high calling, really, maybe to also then say, we think we're here for all of this, and we think we ought to be received in this manner. Well, is that really reasonable to ask of them, to be received in that manner and whatever else? And the more you think through it, maybe the more reasonable it becomes. But it does give you this irritating reality now of two competing perspectives that you've got to reconcile or something. So this would be ways in which I think, though, it goes beyond the cultural knowledge, in that it actually does involve a kind of fundamental respect of these other humans as humans. Therefore, their experience needs to be somehow accounted for and appreciated in the small sense, and at least coming to grasp what it is that they are seeing and feeling and thinking. Again, it does not entail agreeing with that conclusion about things, but it does require maybe abstaining for 1 second from our own judgments about stuff in order to properly grasp what the experience is for that other.
And it's the necessary grasp if you want to win the hearts and minds, right? I mean, and I think that's very much the point you made about Iraq and Afghanistan, without a doubt. I mean, if you're not, with the two competing views or narratives, one that exists in your mind, and the one of those who you're trying to help ultimately, if those aren't aligned, then you're working to different purposes, and ultimately, you can be exploited. That's one, and B, you're not going to achieve the mission. That's right. Which I think is what you were talking about Iraq. Yeah.
And this is why I especially my second deployment, 09 to 10, I was in this advisory effort that I was. We had this whole platoon of soldiers. We'd actually rotate out every 3 months. We got a new platoon that was kind of providing security and transportation as we'd run out to the border and check border police. But a number of those soldiers, we'd have these conversations on the 6-hour MRAP drive out to the border. And so many of them, right, almost wanted the relief of just being asked to kick in doors. That's what they signed up for. It's what they trained for and all that stuff. And And
that's the easy part, right? That's the easy one. It's ones and zeros.
Ultimately,
it's ones and zeros, right? It's the dangerous one, but it's the ones and zeros. Yeah.
Right. And this, I mean, I'm sure you see it among your ranks. I know I see it among mine, where a number of folks want to latch onto those ones and zeros version of military service, right? And let's just stick to that. Feel more comfortable with it. Certainly feel more trained to do it, and all that. And so it's a real test of professionalism in a way. If we're going to receive the objectives that were given to us and say, okay, what do those objectives demand? Well, guess what? They demand an empathetic approach, which, by the way, I'm not even convinced empathy is relevant for just counterinsurgencies. I think there's all sorts of ways it's relevant, for more conventional showdowns as well. So I think empathy's got kind of epistemic or knowledge-based benefits as well as moral benefits. The epistemic thing, what I mean by that is it keeps us treating enemies in a more realistic manner than we otherwise might. Where we might wrongly assume too little of them, right? Either they're not smart or they're not motivated or not any of these things. It's so easily done, right? But a genuinely empathetic grasp of an enemy helps you best anticipate what they're actually capable of doing.
Well, so it's
got a great pragmatic benefit.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the wars we've fought. I mean, I've talked to Dave Kilcullen, and when we mentioned him previously in our discussion, he makes the point quite credibly. We haven't won a war really, a real war since World War II, and we've got to stop and ask. I mean, how many times have we judged the Viet Cong as given them derogatory names and dehumanized them into something less than us? How many times have we done that to the Taliban or any of the insurgents in Afghanistan, to ISIS in Iraq, etc.? Right? Because we fail to recognize that, hold on a minute, just because we have all the guns and all the bells and whistles and all the precision munitions, etc., doesn't mean we have all the knowledge to be able to actually, be superior on the battlefield, as we've seen we haven't been.
Right. And somewhere in here, there really probably is an important threshold that we need to recognize of there's a point where you might ask the military to do too much, or ask them to be ready to do any number of things across too wide of a spectrum. This is one reason I'm glad in the U.S. military or in the U.S. Army, we've actually stood up these security force assistance brigades. And we've carved out a portion of the element that's going to be really good at this advisory thing that for so many of us in the conventional Army being tasked to do it, it just felt like a complete foreign matter, right? Like it's just out of our
it's a different language, right?
Yeah. And it was frustrating maybe there for a few years, right? This assumption that, hey, you take a brigade combat team, give them 6 months advance notice, and they can be ready to do anything, right? Across that entire spectrum. That's just a bit of hype.
That's so interesting. So, I haven't heard of that. So maybe if you're comfortable to talk about it, to give a little bit more insights into what are these brigades and what are their future roles intended to be?
Yeah, my knowledge is fairly shallow, but happy to talk about Security Force Assistance Brigade. I want to say it's been now, trying to do the math right, in the last decade, I think, would be the real safe time span in which there's been this kind of sequential standing up of ultimately the goal was 5 SFABs scattered across a few different Army posts, and they're regionally aligned. So the idea is that the members of these advisory brigades would be able to dive quite a bit deeper than your typical brigade combat team turn advised this brigade. That was one of the turns back in the day.
Yeah.
They're also composed, by the way, again, as I've watched it come about, the battalion commanders are all second-time battalion commanders. They've already been a battalion commander, maybe in a conventional unit. And I believe the rank structure goes down to only staff sergeant. So they're smaller,
senior
right?
soldiers.
They're composed of these smallest level of these advisory teams, all the way up to an overall brigade staff that's maybe helping oversee training and operations.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's very insightful. Yeah. That's that. I mean, it's reassuring to hear that obviously the lessons from your Iraqs, Afghanistans, etc., are being learned somewhere, and there's recognition that, well, we haven't done it necessarily well, and I put Australians in this as well. I mean, we haven't done it any better, if at all, than you guys, right? In the understanding the context, perhaps we have a different cultural context in how we apply and how we carry out operations, but we're also a much smaller force, and we can also invest a little bit more individual knowledge in our individual soldiers than perhaps you guys do. But also we don't do we haven't done any of the heavy lifting that you guys try to do, which is again perhaps a side point. But one of the things that I really want to touch on is operationalizing empathy. So for the soldier on the ground, if we're imagining the soldier who is empathetic to the people that he or she are trying to help, solve whatever problems they might be facing, doesn't empathy, and you talk about them needing to be vulnerable, doesn't that vulnerability also leave them open for exploitation? And we've seen, again, I can put myself in other people's shoes, and I've seen how someone's empathy can be exploited by a skilled manipulator, and I don't even want to say the manipulator, but somebody who's skilled at surviving, which oftentimes is the very people that we're trying to help, right? They've survived in the Afghan-Iraqi context, decades of war. There's a reason why they're alive, and now they're dealing with us. And if we show too much empathy, or not too much, but even if we show empathy, we might be taken for a ride. How can we address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we address it by recognizing empathy is not some kind of silver bullet that solves all problems. That's absolutely something I try to mention a couple times in the book, that hey, I'm trying to keep empathy from getting zero attention. Not suggesting that it's all that needs attention. And so I think our employment of empathy, our practice of it, absolutely needs to be balanced by maybe some healthy suspicion, balanced by real, genuine critical thinking and deep grasp of even maybe an etic understanding, or can still contribute maybe in terms of helping us grasp what's going on around us, and maybe help us identify some contradictions maybe that all of a sudden become a hint of like, wait a minute, what this person's telling me, this is a bit of a false story or something. So I think empathy balanced with other skills, traits, and virtues is one way to offset the concern. It's also probably quite important to be brainstorming with others, right? So as much as possible anyway, right? It's not a thing you're trying to navigate alone. That's going to have to be the case given certain scenarios or certain circumstances. But to me, it emphasizes the need to maybe be explicit about empathy, recognize its benefits, and along the way also, explicitly recognize its limitations or ways in which it can lead to certain excesses. Yeah. And then it also leads to a kind of management of empathy, where you do as much as possible to ensure that the length of the deployment or the difficult details that occur maybe are not chipping away at the empathy in a way that really skews their judgment of what counts as empathetic, or their ability to exercise any of it at all.
Yeah. Well, that's that kind of degradation of empathy over time, or just of compassion, or of just even your own sense of right or wrong over time can degrade, and ultimately can lead to behaviors that later we call war crimes, which is something that of course perhaps we're wrestling with in Australia. And ultimately we could call those allegations as the absolute lack of empathy, where you've become so callous to the suffering and pain of others that it's completely irrelevant. That they are completely irrelevant, given how you're feeling, which of course is hugely dangerous. It also takes me to the next point that I wanted to cover is that's and which I really liked in the book, is that the principle of right intention. You make the point that the principle of right intention is all but absent from the scholarship of jus in bello, or the conduct of war, which of course the right intention, as we know, sits fairly squarely in the jus ad bellum, or the justification for a given war, or declaration of a given war by our political leaders. but it's absent in the conduct of, in other words, absent in the actual carrying out of military operations by the soldiers, commanders on the ground. What do you mean by that? And why is that? Firstly, why is that really important? And then how does empathy play into it? I found this to be a very, very, very critical part of your book.
Yeah. I mean, right intention is defined, by the earliest just war theorists would be this commitment to a just and lasting peace between the warring parties. So
basically, can we just explain that a little bit more? Because I just don't want to glaze over that, right? Because I think that's a really important point. What do we mean by a just and lasting peace, and where does that play into it? I mean, how does that play into the just war tradition or the conduct of any war?
Yeah. So another element of jus ad bellum, right, from the just war tradition would be this fundamental notion of just cause. That, hey, you're not allowed to initiate a war, right, unless you have a justified cause that warrants that level of trouble, of death, of interruption of another community's livelihood, the expense of blood and treasure. And so a just cause, might be one where fundamental rights are just being obliterated on a large enough scale, and there's no other options, that can address the injustice besides war. So you've got this last resort being met. Right intention made its way as another like principle that needs to be fulfilled, because there's this recognition of this thing that's maybe fundamental to human nature, right? Funny how a country might have a just cause, and yet their actual intention might be something else. Of, hey, I'm being treated unjustly, by country Y, and so country X is going to initiate a war against country Y. And yet, in reality, if you could listen to their private deliberations, they actually just really hate country Y, and they can't wait to secure all the additional ports and sea access and stuff that country Y has. And they've got, and by the way, they've got all these rich mineral deposits and other things. And then all of a sudden, the actual motivation for the war is no longer addressing the injustice, right?
You're talking about proxy wars, right? You're literally talking about proxy wars, right?
Possibly,
in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But even in a direct war, right? But yeah, absolutely. With proxy wars too, it can be very easy to there be a legitimate just cause, and yet the actual motivation to participate is for all these other self-serving reasons, not the just cause itself. So right intention is this separate principle that's laid out of like, hey, you got to actually to be morally justified, you got to actually want to address the injustice, and that's got to be the heart of what's driving you to war. Mm-hmm. It can't be these other self-serving things. That's the actual private motivation. Mm-hmm. And then also, big picture from the just war tradition, the idea is that any given country in and of itself has got a legitimate right to exist. And even if it acts aggressively and maybe commits injustices against another, the point is to police up the injustice. The point is not to necessarily eradicate, the aggressive country altogether. The just
which is the just and lasting peace component. Yeah.
Right. And so a just and lasting peace would be one that's maybe involving a kind of reconciliatory coexistence, if you will, not what in some of the literature they'll call a negative peace, but more of a positive peace. Negative peace would simply like, you know what, no one else is left standing. So sure, you're at peace, but it's because you're the only country remaining or something. That's not the peace maybe that being referred to when we start talking about a right intention towards a just and lasting peace.
Yeah. And I think the way I read it in your book, and I really kind of visualized it well in my mind, was that every war should be fought, and every war, ideally, is fought with that in mind, right? That we are only fighting this war because we've met these thresholds, and it is only in order to achieve a just and lasting peace. If a just and lasting peace is not our disposition, or is not the way we're fighting this war, then empathy slides out so quickly. Because if our intention is, if it creeps into our mind that it is merely about killing or killing the other, right? It's a zero-sum game. It's you or me. That disposition in itself neuters any potential empathy that you might develop towards your enemy or combatant that you might be facing on the ground. Which is why I thought it was such a poignant point to make, that starting a war and really implanting this idea in our warfighters from the top all the way down to the lower soldier, that the ultimate aim is to achieve a just and lasting peace, and to really inculcate that. As much as we might say that and it kind of rolls off the tongue, I don't think, again, we talk about the depths of what that actually means and how we achieve that as the ultimate victory, right? And that's victory in a way. And how do we achieve that? Or is that's one metric of how we measure that we have been successful in a particular campaign or war, right?
Maybe the highest measure too.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yes.
Maybe the ultimate measure that matters more than maybe the more quantifiable measures that we'll so often settle for. But look, some of these early just war tradition thinkers, it gets to be kind of fascinating when they get into this right intention thing, and this, in some regards, might be the hardest thing to grasp, or the most weird sounding thing to our modern ear. But there's a number of Augustine comes to mind, Aquinas comes to mind. There are a couple of these thinkers who they would suggest, in a way, a soldier doesn't even intend to kill the enemy. The soldier kills the enemy if the enemy forces his hand, if you will. There's no actual killing intention harbored in the heart of a morally right soldier. But notice how weird that sounds. And what a slippery.
If you'd like to hear the rest of this episode and gain access to all of the episodes of The Voices of War, simply become a subscriber using the link in the show notes. As you know, I will not feature any ads on the show, which is made possible solely through the support of our subscribers. If you find value in the content, you can become one now.